a stretch of French road east of Chartres, late August 1944. It is somewhere past midnight, and there are no headlights anywhere in the darkness. A young American soldier grips a steering wheel with both hands and leans forward until his face is almost against the windshield, because that is the only way he can see anything at all. His truck is loaded with high-octane gasoline and artillery shells, several tons of it, stacked and lashed down behind him. The only light he is permitted comes from two thin slits fitted over the headlamps, painted down to a sliver, throwing a dull glow a few feet in front of the bumper. The drivers call them cat eyes. He cannot use real headlights, because real headlights would bring German aircraft down on the whole column. So he feels his way down the road at 30, sometimes 40 miles per hour, in a line of trucks he can barely make out, each one a shape a little darker than the night around it. He has been awake for most of 2 days. His hands have gone half numb against the wheel. If he stops, the truck behind him stops, and the truck behind that one, and somewhere far ahead, a tank battalion that is winning the war runs dry and stops with them. So he does not stop. He drives through the night, delivers his load toward the front, turns the empty truck around, and drives back to do it again. And he will keep doing this, night after night, for nearly 3 months. History remembers the men at the front of that column. It remembers the generals with the ivory-handled pistols, and the tank crews racing across France, and the paratroopers dropping into the dark. It does not, for the most part, remember him. And yet, without him, none of the rest of it moves at all. This is the story of how the fastest army the world had ever seen was kept alive by a man in a truck cab with his hands frozen to the wheel. It is the story of a job so unglamorous that the war almost forgot it happened, done in large part by soldiers their own country had decided were not fit to fight. And it is the story of why the side that could build that man, and the side that could not, were divided by something far deeper than courage. Here is the strange thing about the summer of 1944, the thing that does not fit the way we usually tell this story. In the first weeks after the Normandy breakout, the Allied armies were not stopped by the Germans. They were stopped by themselves. They were stopped by gasoline that existed, in enormous quantity, sitting in dumps back near the invasion beaches, and could not reach the tanks that needed it. The most powerful army ever assembled ground to a halt in early September, not because the enemy in front of it was too strong, but because the distance behind it had become too long. General George Patton, whose Third Army was tearing across France faster than anyone had planned for, was reduced to pleading for fuel. He put it in a line that has followed him ever since. His men, he said, could eat their belts, but his tanks had to have gas. It was not a boast. It was a confession of the one thing that could beat him, and it had nothing to do with the German army. Patton could outthink and outfight the enemy in front of him. What he could not do was manufacture gasoline out of empty road. That is the paradox at the center of this story. The Allies were winning so fast that the winning itself was strangling them. Every mile the tanks advanced was another mile the supplies had to travel to catch up, and the system meant to carry those supplies had been shattered before the advance even began. To understand how strange this is, you have to understand that it was not a failure of production. America was drowning in materiel. Factories back home were turning out trucks and shells and fuel faster than any nation in history had ever managed. The problem was never that the supplies did not exist. The problem was that between the harbor where they came ashore and the front line where they were needed, there had opened a gap of more than 300 miles, and almost nothing left to carry them across it. Why was that gap there at all? The answer is a chain of decisions, most of them individually correct, that combined into a crisis nobody had fully wanted. In the months before D-Day, Allied bombers had systematically destroyed the French railway network. This was deliberate, and it was wise, because those same railways would otherwise have carried German reinforcements straight to the invasion beaches. The bombing did exactly what it was meant to do, but a railway destroyed to trap the enemy is also a railway you cannot use yourself once you have taken the ground. When the Allies broke out and raced east, they raced across a country whose rail lines they had personally reduced to twisted steel and cratered earth. The very success of the pre-invasion bombing campaign had helped set the supply trap that now closed around them. The ports made it worse. The Germans understood that a working harbour was worth more to the Allies than any city, and they defended the French ports with everything they had. When they could no longer hold them, they demolished them. Cherbourg fell in late June, but its harbour had been so thoroughly wrecked, its cranes toppled, its basins mined and blocked with sunken ships, that it took weeks of hard engineering work to bring even part of it back into use. The other great ports along the coast held out as fortified garrisons or were smashed beyond quick repair. And the greatest prize of all, the vast port of Antwerp far to the north, would be captured almost intact in early September, and then sit useless for nearly 3 more months. The docks were fine, the problem was the sea. The long approach to Antwerp ran up an estuary called the Scheldt, and both banks of that estuary were still held by German troops with guns that could sink any ship that tried to pass. A port you cannot sail into is not a port. It is a decoration on a map, so the supplies piled up near the beaches, and the front raced away toward Germany, and the empty space between them widened every single day. This is the part of the war that rarely makes it into the films, because it has no obvious villain and no single dramatic battle. It is a problem of tonnage and distance and time, a matter of moving weight across space faster than the enemy could. And it was solved, to the extent it was solved at all, not by a weapon and not by a genius, but by thousands of men driving trucks through the dark. Now, at this point you might reasonably guess how such a problem gets solved. You might guess it was cracked by some brilliant new machine, or by fleets of cargo aircraft, or by a stroke of tactical genius from a famous commander. It was none of those things. The thing that kept Patton moving was almost aggressively ordinary. It was a fleet of standard cargo trucks, driven around the clock over 2 commandeered highways, by men that much of the army did not even consider fit to carry a rifle in combat. If stories like this one interest you, the forgotten machinery behind the battles everyone thinks they already know, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of history reach the people who care about it. The system was given a name borrowed from the American railroads. For generations, in American railway yards, to red ball a shipment meant to send it express, top priority, straight through, with everything else shunted aside to let it pass. Railroad crews marked those urgent freight cars with a red ball symbol so they could be spotted instantly across a crowded yard. And so, when the United States Army improvised an emergency truck route to rush supplies from Normandy to the racing front, someone reached for that old railroad word, and the Red Ball Express was born. It began on August 25, 1944. Almost nobody driving it on that first day imagined that it would become one of the most important logistics operations of the entire war, or that its name would still be spoken 80 years later. Somebody, of course, had to build the thing, and build it in a matter of days out of almost nothing. The broad concept of a controlled express route was shaped at the top by the theatre's transportation chief, Major General Frank Ross, whose office ran nearly all the movement of supplies across the European theatre, and by the commanders of the Rear Area Supply Organization racing to keep the front fed. But the frantic, hands-on work of actually gathering the trucks and the drivers and throwing them onto the road fell to officers further down. One of them, a motor transport officer who drove the operation forward with such ferocity that the men nicknamed him Little Patton, spent those first days scraping together every truck and every able driver he could lay hands on, pulling vehicles and men from anti-aircraft units, from infantry divisions still waiting to move up, from anywhere a wheel could be found. Whole units were handed a mission overnight, for which they had barely trained. The system was invented under pressure, in real time, by men who did not have the luxury of getting it right first and running it second. They had to do both at once, while the tanks up ahead were already running dry. The idea itself was simple, which is exactly why it worked under pressure. Take 2 roughly parallel highways running from the supply dumps back near Saint-Lô out toward the forward depots in the triangle of country around Chartres and Dreux, just west of Paris. Close them completely to civilian traffic. Make each one strictly one way. On the outbound highway, every truck runs loaded, nose to tail, toward the front. On the return highway, every truck runs empty, back toward the beaches to be filled again. No oncoming traffic, no crossing streams of vehicles at junctions, no stopping to argue over the right of way, just one enormous loop, a conveyor belt made of trucks, turning day and night, carrying the war forward one load at a time and coming back for the next. Military police stood at the junctions and waved the convoys through. Signboards marked with a red ball pointed the way, so that an exhausted driver in the dark did not have to think about his route. He only had to follow the ball, and the trucks moved. Within days of the loop opening, the tonnage reaching the front jumped by nearly half. The operation grew explosively. At its very peak, on August 29, 1944, the Red Ball put almost 6,000 trucks on the road at once and hauled more than 12,000 tons of supplies to the front in a single day. Consider that number for a moment. More than 12,000 tons, in one day, carried by hand-loaded trucks, over a round trip that could run several hundred miles, driven in large part by men who had not slept properly in longer than they could clearly remember. Across its whole life, from that first day in August to its last in November, the Red Ball Express moved more than 412,000 tons of gasoline, ammunition, rations, and equipment. It supplied 28 different divisions. For a critical stretch of that autumn, it was very nearly the only thing standing between the Allied advance and a dead stop, and the loop only grew longer as the front pushed east. What began as a run of a few hundred miles stretched, as the armies advanced, into round trips that could approach 1,000 miles or more from the beaches to the forward depots and back. The route was extended again and again to chase the moving front, reaching out past Paris and on toward the German border. A driver might spend the better part of 2 or 3 days on a single circuit, loading, running the outbound leg through the night, unloading near the guns, and turning around to run the empty leg back for another load. The farther the tanks advanced, the harder the trucks had to work simply to reach them, and the operation strained to keep its grip on a front that would not stop moving away from it. To understand why a truck could matter that much, you have to understand what a modern army actually eats. A single American division in 1944, at full operation, consumed something on the order of 750 tons of supplies every single day just to keep functioning. Fuel, ammunition, food, oil, spare parts, medical supplies, everything. Multiply that appetite across all the divisions fighting in France, and you arrive at a daily hunger of tens of thousands of tons that had to be delivered from the coast, without fail, or the whole advance began to starve. And the single hungriest item on that entire list was fuel. By late August, the American armies in northern France were burning through roughly 800,000 gallons of gasoline every day. An armored division could drink tens of thousands of gallons just to move itself 100 miles forward. Patton's tanks did not run on bravery, and they did not run on brilliant maneuver. They ran on gasoline, and gasoline had to be physically carried to them, gallon by gallon, in cans and drums stacked on the backs of trucks, and driven to wherever the tanks happened to be that night. There is a small object at the center of this that deserves a mention, because the whole fuel supply of the advance rode on it. The gasoline did not travel in neat tanker trucks for the most part. It traveled in the flat-sided, 5-gallon steel can that the Allies had copied from a captured German design and produced by the millions. Every one of those cans had to be filled by hand, loaded onto a truck by hand, carried forward, unloaded by hand, and eventually collected and sent back to be filled again. The armies went through these cans at a frightening rate. They were dented, punctured, lost, buried in mud, or simply never returned, and the shortage of them became its own quiet crisis, running underneath the fuel crisis. Losing the cans meant you could not move the gasoline even when you had the gasoline, and each one that leaked, or was tampered with, or let water seep into the fuel, could kill an engine hundreds of miles up the line. The War of the Deuce and a Half was, at its most basic level, a war fought 5 gallons at a time. So this humble machine, the ordinary cargo truck, quietly became one of the most decisive weapons of the entire war. And it is worth stopping to look closely at the specific vehicle that did most of the work, because it has earned the attention. It was the 2.5-ton, six-wheel drive truck, built by GMC. Every soldier who ever rode in one knew it by its nicknames: the Jimmy, the Deuce and a Half. It was not fast, it was not comfortable, and it was not in any way clever. It had a straight 6 gasoline engine, a manual gearbox, and drive to all 6 of its wheels, which let it claw its way forward through mud and broken ground that would strand almost anything else on the road. It was rated to carry 2.5 tons, and the men who drove it routinely loaded it with twice that weight and dared it to complain. It rarely did. It was not alone on the roads either. Alongside the Deuce and a Half ran lighter trucks, heavier tractor-trailers, and a strange and brilliant cousin, the amphibious truck that could swim ashore straight from a ship and then drive inland on the same wheels, carrying its load without ever being unpacked at the water's edge. But the 2.5-ton workhorse was the backbone of it all, the vehicle that did the endless middle-distance hauling, and it carried everything an army could need. Not only fuel, but artillery shells and rifle rounds by the ton, boxes of rations, coils of signal wire, medical supplies, engineering equipment, replacement parts, and, when the need arose, soldiers themselves, packed onto the cargo bed and driven forward to the fight. Whatever the front needed, the trucks carried, and whatever the trucks could not carry did not arrive. What turned this plain truck into a war winner was not any single clever feature. It was that America built it in numbers no other country on earth could come close to matching. More than 560,000 of these trucks rolled off American assembly lines during the war. More than 560,000. It was, after the Jeep, the most heavily produced American military vehicle of the entire conflict. This is the quiet foundation the whole story rests upon. Not a wonder weapon, but an ordinary, reliable, endlessly reproducible workhorse, stamped out by the hundreds of thousands, until the United States Army had so many trucks that it could afford to run them into the ground, abandon the wrecks, and simply reach for more. Abundance itself became a kind of weapon, and the men at the very top understood it. After the war, the Supreme Commander himself, Dwight Eisenhower, looked back and named the handful of pieces of equipment he believed had mattered most to victory in Africa and Europe. His list was not what you might expect. It was not the tank, and it was not any famous fighter aircraft. It was the bulldozer, the Jeep, the transport airplane, and the 2.5-ton truck. And Eisenhower pointed out the curious thing that tied them together. Not one of those 4 machines was designed to fight. Every one of them existed to build, to carry, or to move. The commander who had run the largest military operation in human history had concluded that the war was won as much by the machines that hauled it as by the machines that killed. The Deuce and a Half was right there on his short list, sitting quietly beside the Jeep. Now picture the reality of driving one of these trucks on the Red Ball, because the tidy statistics hide the human cost, and the human cost is the true center of the story. The official rules of the operation were sensible, and they were almost entirely ignored. There was a set speed limit, kept deliberately low for safety on the crowded roads. Trucks were supposed to keep a fixed interval of 60 yards apart, so that a single strafing aircraft or a single mine could not destroy a whole cluster at once. Convoys were supposed to halt at regular intervals for rest, food, and maintenance. In practice, the drivers stripped the governors off their engines, the small devices fitted to cap the top speed, so they could push the trucks faster than the machines were ever meant to go. They closed up the safe gaps to keep from losing the truck ahead in the dark. They skipped the halts. There was a grim saying about those trucks and the men who drove them. They broke, but they did not break. The mission was to get the supplies forward, and everything else, including the driver's own safety, came a distant second to that. They drove at night without real lights, feeling their way forward by those dim cat-eye slits, hauling loads of high-octane fuel and high-explosive down roads that might be mined, that might be cratered, that might end without warning at a bridge the retreating Germans had blown into the river. Enemy aircraft hunted the convoys whenever the weather and the front line allowed it. There were snipers in some sectors and hijackers in others, because a truckload of gasoline was worth a small fortune. On the black market in Paris, A single 5-gallon can of army fuel could sell for $100, and whole loads sometimes vanished into that trade, guarded against by armed men riding the convoys. The drivers slept in their cabs when they slept at all. Some accounts record men staying at the wheel for a day and a half at a stretch, fighting to keep their eyes open on straight dark roads, where the greatest enemy was not the Germans but their own exhaustion. And all the while they fought a second, constant war against the machines themselves, because the trucks, magnificent as they were being worked far past any reasonable limit. In the first month of the operation alone, the Red Ball wore out 40,000 tires, engines seized from overwork and from water that condensed in the fuel or was slipped into it by sabotage. Transmissions failed under the strain of overloading. Broken-down trucks were shoved to the roadside and abandoned where they died when there was no time to repair them, later stripped for the parts that might keep another truck alive one more night. The wastage was staggering, and it was accepted, because the only thing that mattered was that the loads kept moving forward. The toll on the men was harder to measure, but just as real. Accidents were common on those crowded, blacked-out roads. Trucks running off the verge in the dark, collisions in the dust, loads shifting and overturning on tight bends, taken too fast by drivers, too tired to slow down. The sheer speed the operation demanded, the stripped governors and the closed-up gaps, made the roads themselves nearly as dangerous as the enemy. A driver could survive the strafing runs and the mines and still be killed by a moment's inattention at the wheel after 30 hours awake. And the trucks that survived were often held together by improvisation, kept running by mechanics working in the open at all hours, cannibalizing the dead vehicles for the parts to save the living ones. Maintenance never caught up. There was never time. The whole operation lived permanently on the edge of breaking down entirely, and only the constant effort of the men kept it from tipping over. And here is the fact that sits at the very heart of this story, the fact that turns a logistics operation into a piece of American history that still matters today. The great majority of the men doing this punishing, essential, and largely invisible work were African American soldiers. In the rigidly segregated United States Army of the Second World War, black soldiers were, with very few exceptions, kept out of the combat arms and funneled instead into the service branches. They cooked, they built roads and bridges, they loaded and unloaded ships in the ports, and above all they drove trucks. The Army's own official history later recorded the number plainly. Roughly 73% of the truck companies in the European theater's motor transport service were African American. In plain terms, close to 3/4 of the men who kept the Red Ball Express running through that autumn were black. They numbered in the many thousands, and without them, the advance across France simply does not happen. Sit for a moment with the contradiction buried in that fact. These men were considered by the army they served, by the settled official policy of their own country, to be unsuited for the front line, not trusted to be entrusted with the main fighting, and yet the entire front line depended upon them. The tank crews, the infantry, and the famous generals whose names fill the history books were, to a very real and measurable degree, kept alive night after night by soldiers their own army had decided in advance were second class. It is worth remembering just how stark the segregation was. Of the nearly 30,000 American soldiers who came ashore at Omaha Beach on D-Day, only about 500 were African American. Black soldiers made up a large and growing share of the wartime army, close to 700,000 men in uniform by that summer, and they were overwhelmingly directed into exactly this kind of labor: vital, exhausting, dangerous, and unglamorous. The kind of work a country can lean on completely and still contrive to forget. The work bred its own hard culture, its own rules and rhythms. At the road junctions and through the towns, military police units controlled the flow, waving convoys through, holding others back, and keeping the one-way loop from tangling into gridlock. One photograph from that autumn became a small icon of the whole effort. A military policeman standing in the road, arm raised, waving a line of Red Ball trucks forward through the dust. The drivers learned to read the route by its signs and its landmarks, to nurse an overloaded engine up a grade, to change a shredded tire in the dark and be moving again in minutes, to keep the truck ahead, just barely in sight without piling into it. They learned to sleep sitting up in a jolting cab for a stolen hour while a partner drove, and to trade places without losing the convoy. It was skilled, punishing, dangerous labor, and the men who did it took a fierce pride in doing it well, whatever the army thought of them. Listen to how the men themselves described the job, because their own plain words carry more weight than any narration ever could. Staff Sergeant Chester Jones, of the 34 18th Trucking Company, remembered the night driving with a kind of hard-earned pride. His drivers, he said, did a fantastic job driving with those slits, the cat eyes as they called them, at night, loaded down with high-octane gas and all sorts of ammunition and explosives. Their speed, he recalled, was 30 to 40 miles per hour, no matter what the weather, and they drove every night. James Rookard, a 19-year-old draftee from Maple Heights, Ohio, serving in a truck company that supplied the front, put the danger of it even more plainly. They had to drive slowly at night because of the cat eyes, he said, and you could hardly see. If you turned on your headlights, the Germans could bomb the whole convoy. So they had to feel their way down the road, and on the sheer relentlessness the job demanded, Rookard said something that captures the whole spirit of the operation in a few words. When General Patton said for you to be there, he remembered, you were there, even if you had to drive all day and all night. The trucks just kept running. They would break down, the men would fix them, and they would run again. That was the bargain these men made, night after night, without applause. And they made it while carrying a second burden that the white soldiers driving alongside them did not have to carry. They were serving a country that treated them, by law and by custom, as inferior, in an army that segregated them off duty as thoroughly as on. They were warned by their own commanders not to mix freely with white soldiers, for fear of the trouble it might cause. They were pouring out their strength and risking their lives for a nation that in much of its own territory would not seat them at the same lunch counter or let them sleep in the same hotel. And many of them understood, with complete clarity, exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it. They wanted to prove something. They wanted to demonstrate, through work no one could honestly dismiss, that they were as capable, as brave, and as necessary as any soldier in any uniform, and to send that proof home to the people who were watching and hoping. The Red Ball Express was, among everything else that it was, a chance to answer a question about the worth of these men, a question their own country had already presumed to answer, and was now, mile by mile and load by load, being proven wrong about. For all of that, the story is usually told, on the rare occasions it is told at all, as a footnote to the main event. The armies that raced across France got the headlines and the newsreels and the films. The men who fueled that race got a paragraph, if they were lucky. Part of the reason is simple and old. History tends to arrange itself around the dramatic and the visible, the battle and not the supply dump, the general and not the mechanic, the tank crew and not the men who kept the tanks fed. And part of the reason is less comfortable to say out loud. It is easier for a nation to celebrate the machine at the tip of the spear than to examine why the man who fueled that machine was, by that same nation's rules, considered unfit to command it, or even to fight beside it. Now we come to the real turn in this story, the thing that lifts it above a simple tale of hard work and quiet sacrifice. Because it would be easy, and it would be wrong, to say that the Americans simply solved the supply crisis by trying harder, or by driving faster, or by wanting it more than the enemy did. That is not the real answer. The real answer is that America was fighting a fundamentally different kind of war from its enemy, a war built on a foundation that had been laid down not in 1944, but across the previous 40 years, in a country that had learned to think about distance, and machines, and the movement of goods, in a way no other nation on earth quite did. To see it clearly, you have to leave the French roads entirely and look hard at the enemy those trucks were driving toward. Because the German army, the army that had conquered most of a continent, that had frightened the world with the word blitzkrieg, that is remembered even now as a gleaming machine of tanks and mechanized speed, was in truth something very different underneath its fearsome reputation. The German army of the Second World War ran, to a genuinely staggering degree, on the muscle of horses. This is one of the great and persistent misunderstandings of the war, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it in any newsreel again. The famous image of the Blitzkrieg, the fast-moving columns of armor slicing across the map, was real, but it was real only for a relatively small number of elite divisions. It was never the reality of the German army as a whole. Across the entire span of the war, the German army employed something on the order of 2.75 million horses. At any given moment, well over 1 million horses were in service at once, hauling German artillery, German supply wagons, German field kitchens, and German equipment of every kind. The tanks that led the propaganda films were the glittering exception. Behind them, the vast bulk of the German army moved, marched, and was supplied at the ancient, unchanging pace of a walking horse, exactly as armies had moved for thousands of years before them. By late 1944, of more than 260 German divisions in the field, only a few dozen were genuinely armored or mechanized. The rest walked to war, and their supplies came up behind them on hooves and on rail, and on very little else. This was not because German engineers were foolish, or German industry was crude. Germany was capable of extraordinary feats of engineering, and produced some of the finest individual weapons of the war. The horses were there because of something deeper than any single design decision. Germany simply did not have what America had. It did not have the oil, the lifeblood of any motorized force, and never enough of it. It did not have the vast factory capacity needed to build trucks by the hundreds of thousands, and the fuel to keep them all running once built. And, most importantly of all, it did not have the deep national habit of motion that America had spent 2 generations building without ever quite noticing it was building a weapon. Think about what the United States actually was by 1944, not as an army, but as a society. It was a country of enormous distances, knitted together by transcontinental railroads, by nationwide trucking companies moving freight from coast to coast, by an ever-growing web of paved highways, and by tens of millions of privately owned automobiles in ordinary hands. Americans had spent a full generation learning, as an entire people, how to move vast quantities of goods and people across a continent as a matter of everyday routine. That knowledge, that deep collective instinct for logistics and motion, did not politely stay behind in the civilian world when the war came. It was drafted along with the men. It marched straight into the army and put on a uniform. The nation of the assembly line and the interstate freight run turned out to have been, without ever intending it, in training for exactly this fight. There is a personal thread running through this that is almost too neat to be true. Decades earlier, as a young officer, Dwight Eisenhower had ridden along on a famous experiment, an army convoy that set out to drive all the way across the United States by road to test whether motor transport could move a military force over great distances. The roads of that era were so poor that the journey took 2 months and broke down constantly, and the lesson stuck with him for the rest of his life. The American army had been thinking about the problem of moving itself by engine rather than by hoof since before the First World War, when trucks had first proven their worth, chasing raiders across the deserts of the Southwest. The instinct to motorize, to solve distance with machines and fuel rather than with animals and time, was old and deep in the American service by the time it mattered most. Germany, for all its brilliance, had never made that same institutional bet, and could not have afforded it if it had tried. There was a saying that went around the American supply services that caught the whole matter in a single phrase. When Hitler put this war on wheels, it went, "He ran it straight down our alley." That is the entire situation compressed into one sentence. The German army was genuinely superb at the sharp, violent, close-in business of fighting a battle. Man for man, in the clash itself, it was among the most formidable armies the world has ever seen. But the moment the war became a longer contest, a contest of moving mountains of material across great distances, week after week and month after month, it quietly became a contest that America had been built to win before the first shot was ever fired. A nation of railroads and trucking chains and open highways and family cars had, without setting out to, been preparing for the war of supply for 40 years. So when the crisis came in France, when the front line raced away from the ports, and the railways lay in bombed-out ruins, America reached instinctively for the one thing it possessed in almost unlimited supply. Not a secret weapon, trucks, and the men to drive them, and the deep, unglamorous organizational competence to weld both together into a functioning system almost overnight. This is the braided root of the whole story. 3 separate strands that had been growing quietly for years and now twisted together on the roads of France into a single unbreakable cord. The first strand was the machine itself, that 500,000-strong fleet of deuce and a halves, the direct product of American industrial mass production, built to a standard pattern and available in a quantity that made losses survivable. The second strand was the raw material behind the machine, the endless flood of gasoline and rubber and steel that a continental industrial power could pour out year after year without ever running dry, the fuel that fed both the trucks and the tanks they served. American factories built so many trucks that the country could give them away by the hundreds of thousands and still have more than enough for itself. Over the course of the war, the United States shipped well over 400,000 trucks and other vehicles to the Soviet Union alone, and it was those American trucks, as much as any tank, that gave the Red Army the ability to keep moving on the Eastern Front. The same industrial flood that filled the Red Ball Loop in France was simultaneously helping to motorize an ally 2,000 miles away. That is the scale of the thing the German army was up against. Not one supply operation, but an entire continent's industrial output turned to the single problem of movement. And the third strand, the one that is by far the easiest to overlook and the hardest to replace, was the human system. The many thousands of drivers, mechanics, loaders, traffic controllers, and military police who could be gathered, organized, and set running as a single, around-the-clock machine that never truly stopped. No one of these 3 strands was a miracle on its own. Braided together, they were something the German army could not have built no matter how brave or how clever its individual soldiers were, because for Germany, the foundations beneath all 3 simply were not there. Let us go back now to that lone driver we started with, the young man leaning into his windshield in the dark, and let us look at him again with everything we now understand. Because now we can see what he truly was. He was not merely a man doing a hard and thankless job. He was the visible tip of that entire vast American system, the single point where 40 years of railroads and factories and highways and habits of motion finally touched down onto one dark French road at midnight and became a truck moving forward. Every load stacked behind him had been built by the mass production strand, fueled by the industrial strand, and routed to his hands by the organizational strand. And he himself, very often a black soldier in a segregated army, was living proof of one more thing that the war forced into the open. The system had grown so hungry for capable, reliable men that it could not, in the end, quite afford the expensive luxury of its own prejudice. It needed him far too badly to spare him, and the enemy he was driving toward could not answer any of it. A German commander facing Patton's Third Army in that autumn was not merely facing better tanks, or braver men, or luckier generals. He was facing a supply line that could heal and regenerate itself faster than he could ever cut it, that could pour fresh fuel and shells and food into the front at a rate his own horse-drawn and rail-bound columns could never hope to match. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, one of the finest soldiers Germany ever produced, and a man who had learned the hard way in the deserts of North Africa what supply meant, had already put his finger on the thing that was destroying his army. It was not primarily Allied heroism, brave as the Allied soldiers were. Again and again, in his reports and his private papers, he came back to the same cause: the crushing, overwhelming Allied superiority in material and in supply, in guns and in ammunition, and in the deep stocks standing behind them. He understood, as a professional understands his own defeat, that his army was not so much being outfought as it was being outsupplied, outproduced, and outmoved. The story does not quite end with the trucks, though, because there is one more turn to it, one more escalation that shows just how completely America had committed itself to this particular way of making war. The Red Ball Express was a genuine triumph, but it was also, if we are being honest about it, a monster of inefficiency, and the men who ran it knew that better than anyone. Here is the uncomfortable arithmetic at the heart of it. A truck that carries fuel hundreds of miles must also burn fuel to make the journey. The farther the front advanced, the longer each round trip became, and the larger the share of every load that was eaten up, simply keeping the trucks themselves rolling there and back. At its peak, the Red Ball Express was consuming as much as 300,000 gallons of gasoline every single day just to move its own vehicles up and down the loop. It was, in a real sense, an enormous engine that had to burn a huge portion of its own cargo in order to deliver the rest. It wore out those 40,000 tires in a month. It left broken trucks scattered along the roadside. It was never designed to last. It was an emergency measure, a human bridge thrown across a crisis and held in place by sheer endurance, meant only to buy time until something better and less wasteful could be built behind it. And that is exactly what happened, because the Red Ball was always understood to be a stopgap, and the army worked feverishly the whole time to make it unnecessary. Engineers rebuilt the shattered French railways at a genuinely astonishing pace, relaying thousands of miles of track and repairing bridges and yards, until the trains could once again haul more tonnage forward than the trucks ever could, and at a fraction of the fuel cost. Fuel pipelines were pushed forward across France, laid down section by section behind the advancing armies, to carry gasoline the way it was always meant to travel, through a pipe, rather than balanced in cans on a truck bed. And far to the north, the greatest prize of all was finally unlocked, though the cost of unlocking it was terrible. When Antwerp had fallen in early September with its docks intact, it should have ended the supply crisis almost at a stroke. Instead, the chance was very nearly thrown away, because the seaward approaches up the Scheldt estuary were left in German hands while attention turned elsewhere. Clearing them became one of the grimmest campaigns of the Western War. Through October and into November, in flooded polders and freezing water, on ground the Germans had deliberately drowned by breaking the dikes. Canadian, British, and Polish troops fought yard by yard to clear both banks of that estuary. The battle to open Antwerp cost the Allies well over 10,000 casualties, and it was later judged by more than one historian to have been needlessly delayed. Only when the last German guns had been silenced and minesweepers had painstakingly swept the long channel clear could the port finally be used. The first ocean convoy sailed up the cleared estuary and into Antwerp near the end of November. With deep water ports finally working, railways running, and pipelines flowing forward, the emergency that had created the Red Ball was over. The operation was formally shut down on November 16, 1944, having run for just under 3 months. It had done precisely, and only, what it was created to do. It had kept the armies alive through the exact stretch of time when nothing else on earth could, and then it quietly stepped aside and let the permanent system take over. The men who had driven the Red Ball did not go home when it ended either. They kept driving, kept hauling, and some of them found themselves swept into the fighting they had been told they were not fit for. When the Germans launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest in December, the great winter battle that came to be called the Battle of the Bulge, truck drivers were caught up in the chaos along with everyone else. Chester Jones, the staff sergeant whose words we heard earlier, delivered gasoline into that battle and got caught behind the German lines. Near the crossroads town of St. Vith, he and his company helped rescue a group of Allied infantrymen the Germans had forced into retreat. These were supposed to be supply troops, rear area men, and here they were in the middle of the largest battle the American army fought in Europe. The crisis of that December ran so deep, the losses so heavy, that the army did something it had refused to do before. It asked black service soldiers to volunteer to fight as infantry. Thousands stepped forward. Jones remembered the moment with a dry understanding of what it meant. It seemed, he said, that the black soldiers had done a good enough job at the Bulge that no one thought of sending them back to the kitchen, because they were still needed. The barrier had not fallen, but it had cracked, and it had cracked under the weight of exactly the kind of proof these men had been offering all along. But the truck-based method that the Red Ball pioneered under fire did not vanish when the operation closed. It evolved. Every hard-won lesson learned on those first dark roads was poured directly into a whole family of successor operations, each with a name and a color of its own. There was the White Ball Express, running supplies inland from the newly working northern ports. There was the Red Lion route, driven hard to supply the British and Canadian armies to the north during the fighting around Arnhem. There was the express haul out of Antwerp itself, once that great port finally came alive. And, at the very end, there was the greatest of them all, the long-distance express operation that carried the American armies deep across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany in the final months of the war. That last operation had absorbed every lesson of the Red Ball, ran more smoothly, wasted less, and hauled even more tonnage over even greater distances than its famous ancestor. The clumsy, heroic, wasteful improvisation of that first desperate autumn had matured, by the war's end, into something close to a science of supply. The men who had felt their way down those black French roads in August had been, without ever knowing it, the rough first draft of how a modern mechanized army feeds and moves itself. Everything that came after was written on the foundation they laid. There is a verdict to draw from all of this, and it deserves to be stated plainly and without decoration. The soldier at the very front did not win the race across France by himself. He could not possibly have. The spectacular advance that made Patton a legend was owed, in the honest words of one veteran officer who saw it happen, as much to the men who drove the Red Bull trucks as to the men who drove the tanks. Without the trucks, that officer said flatly, the advance across France could not have been made at all. That is not sentiment, and it is not an attempt to hand out participation medals after the fact. It is arithmetic. An army is, before it is anything else, an enormous mouth that must be fed, every day, without pause, or it stops being an army. And the men who fed it were every bit as essential to the outcome as the men who fired the shots. We tend, almost by reflex, to build our histories around the moment of contact, the sharp instant when two armies meet and one of them gives way. But the outcome of that moment is very often decided long before it arrives, and far behind the firing line, by questions that seem at first glance to have nothing to do with courage at all. Who has the fuel? Who has the trucks? Who can rebuild a bombed railway in a week rather than a month? Who has spent 40 years as an entire society quietly learning how to move? The German soldier of 1944 was frequently superbly trained and genuinely, undeniably brave. But he was fighting for an army that, underneath the fearsome reputation, still moved and was supplied at the plodding speed of a horse. The American he faced across that final stretch of France was backed by a machine of supply so vast, so deep, and so relentless that it could burn through 40,000 tires in a single month, shrug at the loss, and simply keep rolling. And the deepest point of all is not about trucks or tires or tonnage. It is about the two very different ideas of a soldier that lay behind the two systems. The German army had built itself, brilliantly, around the initiative and judgment of the individual, the sharp instinct of the frontline commander, the soldier as an artist of battle, trusted to see and to act on his own in the chaos of combat. It produced extraordinary fighting men, and no honest account of the war denies it. The American army built something quieter and, in the end, harder to beat. It built a system, and it treated the individual soldier and his immediate commander less as lone artists and more as vital, replaceable parts inside a single, much larger machine. A machine that had been designed years in advance, in factories and railway yards and army planning offices, long before any particular battle was ever fought or any particular hill ever had to be taken. Both approaches produced brave and capable men in great numbers. Only one of them also produced a river of supply that could not be dammed, diverted, or stopped. Which brings us back, one final time, to the man in the cab where we began. He never once saw the whole picture we have just drawn, and he could not have. From where he sat, hunched forward over that wheel, there was only the few feet of grey road lit by the cat eyes, the heavy load pressing behind him, the next town, the next drop, the long empty drive back, and the bone-deep exhaustion of turning around to do it all again before he had truly rested. He was not thinking about industrial doctrine or national output or the slow movement of history through supply lines. He was thinking about staying awake and staying on the road and getting the load through. And that, in the end, is exactly what makes him the truest symbol of how this enormous war was really won. Not by a single towering hero standing against the odds, but by hundreds of thousands of ordinary, tired, determined people doing unglamorous and essential things, reliably, at a scale no enemy could match, for as long as it took to finish the job. He drove through the dark so that other men could win in the daylight. His own country did not think him worthy of the front line, and he kept that front line alive anyway, night after night, through his own quiet refusal to stop. The recognition that was so long denied him would come slowly and late, and it would come in part because of men exactly like him. Within a few years of the war's end, the sheer weight of what black soldiers had proven, on the Red Bull roads and in the cockpits and in the tank battalions, had helped make the old segregation impossible to defend. In 1948, the President of the United States signed an order ending segregation in the armed forces and demanding equality of treatment for every man in uniform, regardless of his color. The tired young driver on that dark road in 1944 did not know that was coming. He only knew there was a load to move and a war to feed. But he was helping to move that too, 1 mile at a time, without ever being told. When the histories were finally written, most of them forgot him and lavished their pages on the tanks he had fueled. But the tanks would have stopped without him. The whole spectacular race across France would have choked to death in the dust of its own success. The man who quietly kept Patton's army moving across Europe was not the famous general, and he was not the tank crew that got the newsreel. He was a tired young soldier with his hands frozen to a steering wheel, feeling his way down a black road at midnight, carrying the war forward, one heavy load at a time, and asking for nothing in return but the chance to be counted. If this account gave you something to think about, a like helps it reach more people, and subscribing means you will not miss the next deep dive into the parts of this war that rarely make it into the standard histories. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering the men who drove through the dark.